Joe Biden will not be on the ballot in the New Hampshire primary, but that is not stopping his supporters from campaigning for him to win the state. The president opted out of New Hampshire after Democrats scheduled their contest first in that state, flouting Democratic National Committee plans to make South Carolina's primary the first in the nation. But now a group of Biden supporters are calling on New Hampshire voters to write his name on the ballot anyway. Among them, Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, who headlined a conference call for Biden supporters just Thursday night. So will this strategy work, or is New Hampshire a golden opportunity for Biden's challengers? I'm joined by one of the people organizing the write-in campaign here in Massachusetts, Joe Caiazzo, and by Christopher Galdieri, professor of politics at St. Anselm College. Thank you both for being here.
Great to be here.
So, Joe, you've worked for a bunch of presidential campaigns in the past. You organized this conference call that took place the night before you and I are talking right now. What specifically is it that you and other people who are working on this in Massachusetts are trying to get people from Massachusetts to go up to New Hampshire to do?
So there's an incredible amount of enthusiasm for the president throughout the country. I think the level of enthusiasm is often incredibly underreported. And we've seen this come to fruition with events like last night. Within the first minutes of our call to organize to help the efforts up in New Hampshire, we hit the capacity limit on our Zoom that we had to go, and increase.
So does that mean you had a couple hundred people from Massachusetts trying to weigh in?
We had well over 100 people on this call.
Okay. So people, not to oversteer you here, but so people are, you say, interested, enthusiastic about the president. What ideally will Maura Healey and you and all the other people who are part of this call, what will you be doing in the run-up to Election Day or maybe on Election Day itself?
Sure. So, our first number one priority is to fold all this, major enthusiasm and energy for Joe Biden into the existing effort that's happening up in New Hampshire. Right. The all-volunteer leadership there is just absolutely superb. They've put together a crystal clear and concise game plan to help folks really go and understand how to write in Joe Biden's name on the primary day.
So then I assume they'll be educating them beforehand. I've looked at their website, writeinbiden.com, I believe.
Yes.
And then on the day itself,
correct,
people will also be up there?
Correct.
Right? Saying,
correct.
Hey, make sure to write in Biden. Democracy
Absolutely.
is at stake. That's the argument, correct?
Yeah. Look, and every single time former President Trump, every time he goes and opens his mouth, it becomes crystal clear that full democracy is at stake here. And this is an incredibly important election. The stakes have never been higher. I understand that every 4 years, everybody says this is the most important election of your life, but in this case, this is absolutely true. And voters understand that, as do the activists.
Let me get Chris in here. Chris, is it fair to say that Joe and his colleagues here in Massachusetts, also people working on this campaign in New Hampshire, are trying to solve a problem that Biden created for himself? Because this DNC plan to demote New Hampshire to give South Carolina the first primary in this election cycle, with New Hampshire and some other states going later, that came from Biden himself, right?
That's right. And I think, this is the sort of thing that was pretty much an unforced error on the part of the president's campaign, simply because, New Hampshire is a swing state. It is a state where in 2012, then President Obama, in 2020, Donald Trump, put tons of effort into the state, into the primary, so that they could get a running start on organizing in the state for the fall campaign. This sort of standoff between New Hampshire Democrats and the state government on the one hand and the DNC on the other has really forced the president's campaign to just sort of be in idle mode while the primary is gearing up. And I think, it's a missed opportunity for them. And the reason we're here talking about a write-in campaign and whether it can succeed and that sort of thing is really the result of that decision.
Well, let me ask you about whether it can succeed, and then we'll go back to you, Joe. But I know that your colleague Neil Levesque at St. Anselm did some polling recently on the plans that people have when it comes to, okay, if the primary were today, what would you do? And I think we can pull up a graphic. The big takeaway is that the poll, which was conducted in December, shows that only 50% of people who are likely primary voters in New Hampshire, likely Democratic primary voters, say that they would plan to write in Biden. A big chunk aren't sure what they're going to do. Then there's a smaller number that are interested in Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson. So for me, that raises the question, can Joe and his like-minded colleagues get people to write in the president? What do you think? Do you think 50% is where the president's going to land, or can they get that number up to a more respectable level?
Yeah, I think the big challenge for this write-in effort is going to simply be getting people to turn out in the first place. This is a standalone primary. The only thing on the ballot is the presidential nomination. So you don't have people who would be otherwise coming out to vote in a primary for Senate or governor or some other office like that. So you're asking people to get up on a potentially snowy January morning, trudge to the polls, and then fill in a circle and write in the guy who didn't file because his plan to get rid of the first in the nation status for New Hampshire didn't quite come to fruition. So I think I don't expect the president to lose this primary. I would be extraordinarily surprised if Williamson and Phillips polled much better than those numbers showed. But I think, that big gray chunk of not sure people is not just they're not sure if they're going to write in Biden. I think they're not sure if they're going to make time to go to the polls on January 23rd.
Joe Caiazzo, what would a win for Biden, not just in terms of getting more votes than the other candidates, which it seems likely he's going to do, but in terms of getting a percentage of the vote, what would a win look like?
Sure.
As you anticipate the situation?
Sure. Look, I think at the start here, polls go up and polls go down. They're simply a snapshot in time. Something extraordinarily wonderful happened this morning. More people in this country woke up and went to work than ever before. The economy added 216,000 jobs in the month of December. Seniors pay less for prescription drugs today than they did before the president took office, and inflation is well under control. And this is all simply because of the leadership of President Biden. I think when you look at this race, voters are much more cognizant of what's at stake. Trying to guess, what's a win, what's not a win. 50 plus 1 is all that it takes to be victorious on that day.
Let's take a look at the messaging coming from the two candidates who you're trying to work against, the two candidates that you said, Chris, earlier, you don't see getting a ton more support than they're currently getting in that poll done by your colleague Neil Levesque. Let's look first at how Dean Phillips, the congressman from Minnesota, is pitching himself. Then we'll take a look at Marianne Williamson, who's a little more familiar maybe to people since she ran a couple cycles ago.
Things that were affordable are no longer. Mortgage rates are going up. Fuel is too expensive. Food is too expensive. People can't afford childcare.
And I'm on a mission now to do two things. To become president of the United States, to change this incredibly destructive system right now. And I'm also now on a mission to expose the truth about what is happening in our politics.
The Florida Democratic Party, which is unbelievable I'm even saying these words, decided they would not have a presidential primary. They just said Joe Biden's the winner.
The destruction of democracy is not unique to the right. It is happening in front of our eyes right here in your state, and it's happening in Florida right now. It's time for change. It's time for a new generation.
As Franklin Roosevelt said during the Great Depression, he says, it has become clear to me we must become radical for at least a generation. But radical is not a word that we should fear. The Declaration of Independence is radical. The radicalism that we should fear is the radicalism of the last 50 years. It is radical that we have allowed corporate forces to dominate and tyrannize the American people the way we have.
So there we have the two best known, there's other people on the ballot, but the two best known challengers. Chris, what is it that Phillips and Williamson are not doing that perhaps they could do to be more viable than they seem to be? Or is there nothing, really? Are they just destined to be fringy candidates, given the unusual nature of this particular primary?
Yeah, I think, challenging a sitting president in your own party's primary is always an uphill battle. With very few exceptions, it's generally something of a fool's errand. And that's not even necessarily a reflection on the challengers themselves. But usually somebody who has gotten themselves elected president means they've gotten nominated before, and they usually did that for a reason. And I don't really think that Phillips or Williamson have really, articulated a clear reason that should be persuasive to Democrats. One of the things that struck me about that Dean Phillips clip is that he manages to both include some criticisms that you'd expect to come from Biden's left and some that sound very similar to things that people are saying on Biden's right. And I'm not sure either of those has a huge constituency in Democratic primaries.
That does seem like a tricky balance to strike, right? Trying to have it both ways and trying to attract people who are voting in the Democratic primary as you come at the sitting president from both angles. Mm-hmm. Joe, I think you're going to get the last word here. Chris mentioned earlier that New Hampshire is a swing state. So there's this primary, you want a strong outcome for the president, but then there's the question of who carries the state in November. Are you worried that the president's approach to this primary cycle, the fact that you're needing to pitch him as a writing candidate, are you worried that it's going to make it harder for him to carry the state in November and could end up potentially being decisive if it's a razor-close election?
Look, I think at the end of the day, we should take nothing for granted. And we should make every effort to talk to voters about why it's super important to vote for Joe Biden for a second term. I ultimately don't think the intra-party politics will go and weigh in the calculus of voters as they go to make their decision. The state of New Hampshire is an absolutely wonderful place. Voters value their ballot.
Yeah, they love it.
Oh, God, yeah. And look, I think they do their homework. And I think that when you do your homework, and I think that when you step back and you look at the field of candidates, it becomes crystal clear that Joe Biden is the best person to lead our country for 4 more years.
When you talk about people up there doing their homework, I found myself imagining talking to voters, and I swear I could go up there today and I could find someone who told me that they still hadn't heard enough from President Biden or former President Trump. It's a classic New Hampshire approach. Well, we still need to hear a little more from candidates. We're still kicking the tires. Chris Galdieri and Joe Caiazzo, thank you for talking this very interesting and complicated situation through. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.